The Montana dawn unfurled over Whiskey Creek Ranch, casting golden light across plains that stretched like an unbroken vow. Ann Marrow, 40, rode her mare Dust through dew-laden grass, her silhouette carved from resilience and loss. Her hazel eyes, sharp beneath a battered hat, scanned the horizon with a rancher's instinct. Her hands, rough from years of roping and mending, gripped the reins with quiet strength. She was Whiskey Creek, its 1,000 head of cattle, its weathered barns, its soul. True grit defined her. No complaints, just work, etched into every fence post she'd driven into this hard-won land. 3 years after her husband Tom's death in a riding accident, his presence lingered, in the saddle hung by the corral, the cottonwoods he'd planted along the creek. Ann's solitude was her shield, her ranch, her legacy. But as she reached the northern corral, her breath snagged. The gate swung wide, hoofprints churned the mud. Titan, her prized breeding bull, a massive Angus worth her herd's future, was gone. But a glint in the dirt, a broken fence wire with fresh tire tracks, screamed theft. Ann's gut named the culprit, Jesse Calloway, a real estate tycoon whose offers for her land carried a predator's edge. Her jaw clenched, eyes narrowing to slits. This wasn't just a loss. It was a gauntlet thrown. Therefore, she vowed to hunt Titan down, her grit a fire that would either save her ranch or consume everything in its path. Cliffhanger. Could a lone widow stand against a man like Jesse? Or was she riding into ruin? Ann knelt by the tracks, her foreman Cal squinting beside her, his face etched with decades of sun and worry. Titan didn't bolt, she said, her voice low, unyielding. This was deliberate. Cal spat into the dirt, his eyes hard. Trouble hits, Ann. Cowboys don't whine, they fix it. She nodded, his words a mirror to her core. True grit. No tears, only action. It was how she'd rebuilt Whiskey Creek after Tom's death. How she'd face this betrayal now. Titan was her ranch's lifeblood. Without him, her bloodline would weaken. Her legacy would crumble into dust. Jesse Calloway in his tailored suits and Viper's smile had haunted her for months, his offers to buy Whiskey Creek laced with veiled threats. She'd stared him down, but the tire tracks pointed to his holdings, a taunt in the morning light. Therefore, Ann resolved to find Titan and shatter Jesse's scheme. Her fingers traced the wire's jagged edge, her mind a storm of plans. This theft wasn't just personal. It was a calculated strike to break her spirit. She stood, brushing dust from her jeans, her gaze locked on the mountains. The fight would pull her from Whiskey Creek's familiar plains to Billings' alien streets. Grit didn't bow, and neither would she. But as she turned to the barn, a distant engine growled. Too close, too deliberate, a shadow moving on the ridge. Cliffhanger. Was Jesse already watching, poised to crush her before she could strike? Whiskey Creek Ranch sprawled across Montana's heart, its pastures cradled by mountains that glowed in the dawn. Ann ran it with a lean crew, Cal, young Tommy, a few seasonal hands, and her own relentless drive. The barn smelled of hay and oiled leather, the corrals alive with the lowing of cattle. Her herd was her pride, Titan its cornerstone, a massive Angus whose calves promised profit for decades. But Jesse Calloway's shadow loomed, dark and unyielding. His resort empire devoured ranches, turning heritage into golf courses and condos. Last month, he'd cornered Ann at the feed store, his voice smooth, his eyes cold. Sell, Ann, or you'll regret it. She'd walked away, her roots too deep to pull. Her crew felt the tension, their usual banter muted. Over coffee in the mess hall, Tommy, barely 20, whispered, "Heard Jesse's got rustlers on payroll, stealing stock to break folks." Cal hushed him, but Ann's jaw tightened, her coffee untouched. She trusted her people, but Jesse's reach was a cold hand on her spine. She rechecked Titan's pen, finding a scrap of cloth snagged on a post, embroidered with a stylized C, Calloway's brand bold as a slap. Her pulse quickened, anger mixing with dread. But confronting Jesse meant leaving Whiskey Creek exposed. Her crew stretched thin. She paced the porch, Tom's old Winchester gleaming above the door, its barrel a silent promise. Jesse wasn't just after Titan. He wanted her spirit broken, her land his trophy. Her crew watched, their eyes heavy with trust. "Cal, you're in charge," she said, voice like iron. "I'm heading to Billings." Therefore she packed her duffel, binoculars, flashlight, her father's Colt, and climbed into her battered F-150, the ranch fading in her rear view as the highway stretched before her. Cliffhanger. Would her absence give Jessie the opening to strike deeper? Or was she riding toward her only chance to save her home? By noon, Cal found a branded tag from Titan's ear, in a ditch near Jessie's land, tossed like a taunt in the weeds. Anne's blood surged, her fingers closing around the red plastic, its edges sharp against her palm. This wasn't chance. Jessie had stolen her bull to choke her ranch, to force her to sell. The tag was proof of his audacity, a challenge she couldn't ignore. Therefore, she loaded her truck, Colt, maps, a hunting knife, and hit the highway to Billings. Jessie's office towered there, a glass shrine to his greed. She'd demand Titan's return, expose his theft, and end this war. Cal grabbed her arm, his eyes pleading. "Take me, Anne. He's got muscle, maybe worse." She shook her head, her voice steel. "My fight, Cal." Doubt flickered. She knew Jessie's game was dirty, whispers of hired guns and bribed sheriffs trailing him like smoke. Still, she drove, the tag in her pocket, the highway a gauntlet under a gray sky. But as Billings' skyline rose, a black SUV shadowed her, its tinted windows hiding eyes. She felt boring into her soul. She gripped the wheel, her Colt in the glove box, its weight a cold comfort. Jessie knew she was coming. How? Her pulse hammered, but grit kept her steady. She pulled into a gas station, the SUV idling across the lot, its engine a low growl. Therefore, she checked her gun, her resolve hardening. Cliffhanger. Was this a warning, or had Jessie already set a trap to bury her before she reached him? At the gas station, Anne watched the SUV, its engine purring like a predator. Her world was Whiskey Creek. Storms, wolves, broken fences, dangers she could name. Billings was alien. Jessie's rules a labyrinth of deceit. Could she take him on alone? Without Titan, her herd would falter. Debts would crush her, and Whiskey Creek would be auctioned to Jessie's empire. She touched the Colt, its grip worn smooth by her father's hand, his voice echoing, "Stand, even when you're scared." Turning back meant surrender, and Anne didn't know the word. She thought of Tom, his steady hand, his laugh that warmed the coldest nights. He'd have charged in, fearless, but he was gone. She was alone, but Cal's voice rang in her mind. "Fix it!" Doubt clawed, but grit won out. Jessie saw her as a widow to break. She'd prove him wrong. Therefore, she started the truck, the SUV peeling out behind her, its presence a taunt. She'd find Jessie, get Titan, save her home. Billings' lights swallowed her, a concrete jungle where her boots felt out of place. The SUV vanished into traffic, but unease clung like damp cloth. She parked near Jessie's tower, her hand on the Colt, her heart a drum. But a figure watched from the shadows across the street. Friend or foe? Cliffhanger. Had she walked into Jessie's web, or was help closer than she dared hope? Billings' skyscrapers dwarfed Anne's truck. Jessie's office a glass monolith branded with his logo, a beacon of arrogance. Her boots echoed on asphalt, the Colt tucked under her duster, its weight grounding her. The lobby gleamed, marble floors, chandeliers, a receptionist with a cold, practiced smile. "Mr. Calloway's expecting you," she said, her words chilling Anne to the bone. He knew she was coming. But she rode the elevator to his penthouse, her grit a shield against the fear gnawing at her edges. Jessie lounged behind a mahogany desk, his suit pristine, his eyes glinting like a snake's. "Anne, a pleasure," he purred, his voice dripping venom. She slapped the tag on his desk, its clatter loud in the silence. "Where's my bull?" He chuckled, leaning back unfazed. "Sell Whiskey Creek, and I'll help find him." His men flanked the door, hands near holsters, their presence a silent threat. Anne's blood boiled, but her voice stayed even, cutting. "I'll find him myself." Jessie's smile vanished, his eyes narrowing. "You're out of your depth, widow." Therefore, her fight shifted. not just to save Titan, but to dismantle Jesse's empire before he crushed her. She turned to leave, but a stranger blocked her path. Bert Foster, a drifter in a worn leather jacket, his gray eyes sharp with defiance. "She's not alone," he said, stepping beside her, his voice low but firm. Jesse's men tensed, hands twitching. But Bert's stare held them, and Anne nodded, accepting his aid, a lifeline in a sea of danger. They left, the elevator doors closing like a guillotine. Cliffhanger. Who was Bert? And could he be trusted in Jesse's deadly game? Outside, Bert matched Anne's stride, his boots scuffing the sidewalk, his voice low and steady. "Saw you with Calloway. He's poison." A bouncer at a Billings dive bar. Bert carried scars. Wyoming, a brother killed in a deal Jesse botched. His death a wound Bert bore in silence. His life was drift, rootless. But Anne's fire anchored him, stirred something he'd thought long dead. "I know his haunts," he said. "Let me help." Anne hesitated. Trust was a rusty hinge, creaking under scrutiny. But his eyes held pain like hers, a mirror to her own losses, and she needed an ally in this fight. "Why risk it?" she asked, her voice soft but probing. He shrugged, a half-smile tugging his lips. "You're worth it." Their partnership sparked, a slow burn beneath the stakes. Bert knew Jesse's world, stockyards, back rooms, payoffs to dirty cops. Therefore, they teamed up to hunt Titan, Bert's street smarts meshing with Anne's grit. Over coffee at a greasy diner, he shared his brother's betrayal, his voice rough with memory. Anne spoke of Tom's accident, her words halting, raw. "You don't quit," Bert said, admiration raw in his gaze. Her smile was brief, a flicker of warmth. His hand brushed hers, a spark in the dim light. But Jesse's men watched from a parked car across the street, radios crackling, their eyes locked on the diner's windows. Anne's fight wasn't solo anymore, but Bert's choice painted a target on his back. Therefore, they moved fast, planning to hit a stockyard Bert knew from his bar contacts. Cliffhanger. Would their bond hold against Jesse's closing net, or had Anne pulled Bert into her doom? Anne and Bert plunged into Billings' gritty underbelly, chasing Titan's trail through a maze of danger and deceit. At a stockyard under a bruised dusk, cattle lowed in overcrowded pens, their brands shaved to hide their origins. Anne's heart leapt. Titan's bellow cut through the air, unmistakable, a deep rumble that echoed her resolve. They crept through shadows, snapping photos of forged transport logs, Jesse's name scrawled in margins next to dates and payoffs. But guards patrolled, rifles glinting under floodlights, their boots crunching gravel. Bert pulled her behind a crate, his breath warm against her neck, their bodies pressed close in the dark. "We're close," he whispered, his voice steady despite the danger. Their eyes locked, a current flaring, but Anne's grit kept her sharp. No complaints, just focus. They hit a dive bar next, its neon sign flickering like a bad omen, the air thick with smoke and cheap whiskey. Rustlers bragged inside, drunk on Jesse's cash, their voices loud with arrogance. Bert played sloshed, slurring as he coaxed names. Holding pens, truck routes, a cop named Harris on the take. Anne sat in a corner booth, her Colt a cold comfort under her jacket, her eyes scanning for threats. Therefore, they mapped Jesse's ring, trucks moving at midnight, payoffs funneled through a shell company, a secret stockyard as the hub. Each lead tightened their bond, their partnership a rhythm of trust. At a truck stop diner, they shared a booth, Bert's fingers tracing a scar on his knuckles, as he spoke of his brother's laugh, his voice cracking. Anne admitted Tom's death still woke her at night, her voice soft, vulnerable. "You're stronger than you know," Bert said, his gaze warm, unguarded. Her hand covered his, brief but electric, a promise in the quiet. Danger dogged their steps. At a rural lot, they found Titan loaded in a trailer, his massive frame straining the metal. Anne's heart surged, but Jesse's men ambushed, bullets splintering crates, the air sharp with gunpowder. Anne fired back, her aim deadly, dropping a guard with a shot to the knee. Bert tackled another, his fists a blur, blood streaking his knuckles. They fled, photos intact, but the trailer roared away, Titan gone again. But they uncovered a lead, a fortified stockyard, Jesse's nerve center, whispered about in the bar. They drove through the night, tension crackling like static. Anne's grit shone, her silence a vow to save Titan, her ranch, her future. Bert's loyalty anchored her, their shared glances a lifeline in the dark. They stopped at a gas station to refuel, the night heavy with stars, and Bert cleaned a cut on her arm, his touch gentle, his eyes searching. "We'll get him," he said, and she believed him. But a cliffhanger loomed. As they neared the stockyard, headlights flared behind them, Jesse's men closing fast, their SUV a predator in the rear view. Cliffhanger. Could they reach Titan before the trap snapped shut, or was this the end of their hunt? Huddled in a Billings alley, Anne clutched the photos. Proof of Jesse's crimes, but Titan was out of reach, a false victory. Bert checked her for wounds, his hand steady despite the blood on his sleeve, his touch gentle, urgent. "We're not done," he said, his voice a low growl of defiance. Anne nodded, her mind shifting like tectonic plates. Jesse's ring wasn't just her fight. It threatened every rancher in Montana, a network of theft and extortion, bleeding the plains dry. Therefore, she vowed to expose him, to save Titan, and protect them all. Her grit burned brighter, a beacon in the dark. Bert's hand lingered on hers, his gray eyes promising more than alliance, a future, unspoken but real. Their romance deepened, a quiet strength in the chaos. The stakes skyrocketed. Jesse's network was a hydra. Cops on payroll, judges bought, ranchers driven to bankruptcy. Anne felt the weight, her ranch teetering without Titan's calves to sell. Cal called, his voice strained. "Debts are piling, Anne. We're bleeding out." Her resolve flickered, a candle in a storm, but Bert's belief steadied her. "We'll end this," he said, his hand squeezing hers, a lifeline. But a tip from a bar contact placed Titan at a fortified stockyard, bristling with guards and razor wire. It reeked of a trap, but it was their only shot. They armed up, Colt, knives, a stolen radio to eavesdrop on Jesse's men. Anne's heart pounded, but grit silenced fear. She'd never complain, only act. Therefore, they planned a midnight raid, knowing failure meant losing Whiskey Creek, Titan, everything. Cliffhanger. Would they outsmart Jesse's ambush, or walk into his kill zone? Jesse's men tightened the noose, their presence suffocating. SUVs tailed Anne and Bert through Billings' back streets. Phones buzzed with intercepted calls, and shadows moved in every alley. The cracks in their plan widened. Cal betrayed her, his loyalty bought by Jesse's cash. His call came late, voice heavy with shame. "I'm sorry, Anne. Needed the money for my kid." The sting cut deep. Cal was family, his betrayal a knife to her trust. But Anne's grit held. She forgave silently, her focus locked on Titan. Bert's past surfaced, a thug from Wyoming spotting him in a bar, his sneer promising trouble. "Calloway'll pay to know you're here," he spat. Bert's jaw tightened. "I'm not running," he growled, his loyalty to Anne ironclad, his fists clenched. They scouted the stockyard, a fortress of barbed wire and floodlights, its pens packed with stolen cattle. Through binoculars, Anne saw Titan, his bulk unmistakable, his eyes wild but unbroken. Therefore, they planned a raid. Cut the power, free the bull, escape with evidence to bury Jesse. But Jesse was ready, Cal's betrayal tipping him off. As they crept closer, floodlights blazed, pinning them like moths. Guards swarmed, rifles raised, their boots pounding the dirt. But Bert tackled Anne behind a crate, bullets chewing the ground, splinters flying. Her Colt barked, dropping a guard with a shot to the shoulder, but they were outnumbered, outgunned. Jesse's voice crackled over a radio. "Bring me the widow, alive." Anne's blood ran cold, but grit kept her fighting, her shots precise, her mind racing. Bert's hand squeezed hers, a vow to survive, his breath ragged but steady. They dodged between crates, the stockyard a maze of death, guards closing from every angle. Anne's lungs burned, but she never faltered. Her creed, no complaints, just action, driving her forward. But a cliffhanger loomed. A sniper's laser danced on Bert's chest, the red dot a promise of death, the stockyard a trap snapping shut. Cliffhanger. Could they escape? Or was this Jesse's checkmate? The raid shattered in a hail of chaos. Jesse's men surged, bullets tearing the night, the air thick with gunpowder and fear. Bert took a shot to the shoulder, blood soaking his shirt as he shielded Anne, his body a barrier against the storm. She dragged him to cover behind a rusted tractor, her Colt blazing, grit a feral roar in her chest. Titan was loaded onto a slaughter truck, its engine roaring as it pulled away. Their photos torched by a guard, flames licking the evidence to ash. Jesse emerged, smug in his tailored suit, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "Your land, or he dies," he said, nodding at Bert, his pistol steady. Anne's world fractured, her bull, her love, her ranch, all slipping through her fingers. Therefore, she tossed Jesse the deed to Whiskey Creek, her hand trembling as she slipped a tracker onto the truck. A desperate gamble. She saved Bert, but lost everything else. They limped to a ditch, Bert fading, his pulse weak under her fingers. Anne bound his wound, her hands shaking, blood slick on her skin. The evidence was ash, her ranch Jesse's, her grit a hollow echo. Tom's memory mocked her failure, his laugh distant in the wind. But the tracker's signal blinked on her phone, faint but alive, a sliver of hope piercing the dark. She whispered to Bert, "Hold on." His eyes fluttered, trusting her even in pain. Therefore, she carried him to her truck, driving to Whiskey Creek, her fight not over. Cliffhanger. Could the tracker lead her to Titan? Or was it a cruel mirage in her darkest hour? At Whiskey Creek, Anne nursed Bert in the bunkhouse, the ranch a hollow shell under a moonless sky. Jesse's lawyers circled, eviction papers piling like vultures' feathers. She sat by Bert's bedside, his fevered hand in hers, his breath shallow. "I failed," she whispered, her voice cracking. Her grit wavered, Tom's dream, her herd, her home, all slipping away. But Bert stirred, his voice faint but fierce. "You don't quit, Anne. That's who you are." His words cracked her despair, a spark in the void. She checked the tracker, still active, pinpointing a stockyard, its signal a fragile thread. Cal's betrayal echoed, a lesson carved in pain. She'd fought alone too long. Trust had burned her, but isolation was a slower death. Therefore, she chose to fight smarter, to lean on others. She called Ellie, a journalist who'd dogged Jesse's trail for years. "I've got proof," Anne said, sharing the tracker data. Ellie's voice lit up with hunger. This could bury him. But a cliffhanger loomed. The tracker signal flickered, and Ellie warned that Jesse's men were slaughtering stolen cattle to cover tracks. Cliffhanger. Could Anne act before Titan was gone forever? Or had her grit led her to a final loss? Anne rose, transformed, her despair forged into resolve. She sent Ellie the tracker data, fueling an expose ready to launch, its words sharp enough to cut Jesse's empire to ribbons. She rode to neighboring ranches, her grit a rallying cry that echoed across the plains. "Jesse's stealing from us all," she told old Pete, whose herd had dwindled. Fiery Rosa, whose brother lost land to Jesse's schemes, dozens more, their anger a tide. They joined her, a posse of cheated ranchers, their eyes alight with purpose. Bert, bandaged but standing, took her hand, his touch a vow. "I'm with you," he said, their love sealed in shared scars. Therefore, Anne led her coalition to Jesse's stockyard, armed with evidence and fury, a modern cavalry under a starlit sky. The plan was bold. Free Titan, stream Ellie's story live, trap Jesse in his own lies. Anne's heart pounded, but grit silenced doubt. She'd been a lone widow. Now she was a leader. But the stockyard bristled with guards, and Cal stood among them, gun in hand, his betrayal a fresh wound. Anne met his eyes, forgiving but unyielding, her voice steady. Therefore, they moved at midnight, ranchers cutting fences, Ellie's camera rolling, the world watching. Cliffhanger. Would their strike crush Jesse, or had Anne led her allies into a massacre? The stockyard loomed under a blood-red sunset, its pens packed with stolen cattle, Titan's bellow rising like a battle cry. Anne's coalition struck. Ranchers sliced barbed wire with bolt cutters. Ellie streamed live, her feed capturing guards scrambling, their faces pale under the camera's glare. Anne and Bert slipped inside, navigating a maze of pens, their boots silent on the dirt. They found Titan, his massive frame straining a pen, his eyes wild but unbroken. Anne's heart surged, but Jesse's voice boomed from a catwalk above. "You're too late, widow." He stood with Cal, pistol aimed at Anne, his suit immaculate despite the chaos. The betrayal stung, Cal's eyes averted, but Anne's grit held, her voice cutting through the din. "You're done, Jesse," she said, nodding to Ellie's feed now viral, exposing Jesse's payoffs, thefts, and lies to thousands online. Chaos erupted. Ranchers freed cattle, their shouts mingling with the lowing of panicked herds. Guards fired wildly, bullets pinging off metal. Jesse shot, the bullet grazing Anne's arm, blood soaking her sleeve, pain flaring but ignored. Bert tackled him, wrenching the gun away despite his own wound, his face pale but fierce, blood seeping through his bandage. Cal froze, his gun trembling, then dropped it, shame flooding his face. "I'm sorry," he muttered, stepping back, his redemption a quiet surrender. Therefore the tide turned. Siren wails grew, drawn by Ellie's broadcast, now trending nationwide. Jesse's men fled, their loyalty crumbling as police lights flashed on the horizon. But Jesse wasn't done. He lunged for Anne, a knife flashing in his hand, his eyes wild with desperation. She dodged, her Colt steady despite the blood dripping from her arm, and fired, hitting his leg. He crumpled, cursing his empire dust. "For Whiskey Creek," she said, her voice cold, final. Rosa led Titan to safety, her hands deft as she guided him through the chaos. While other ranchers freed cattle, their brands a map of Jesse's crimes. Police swarmed, cuffing Jesse, his snarls drowned by the clamor. The tracker, Ellie's story, and the rancher's courage had won. A victory forged in grit and unity. But Bert collapsed, his wound reopened, blood pooling on the dirt. Anne dropped beside him, her hands pressing his chest, medics rushing in through the fray. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice breaking. Tears she'd never shed burning her eyes. His eyes met hers, a faint smile curving his lips. "Always," he rasped. Medics stabilized him, their hands quick, and Anne's heart steadied, her love a tether stronger than pain. Therefore, Titan was home, Jesse was finished, and Whiskey Creek was hers, its future secured by her unbreakable will. Cliffhanger resolved. Her grit had saved her love, her legacy, and her land. A triumph, written in blood and fire. Weeks later, Whiskey Creek glowed under a summer sunset, its plains alive with promise, the mountains a silent guard. Anne stood on the porch, her arm scarred but healing, Titan back in his corral, his bellow a song of survival. The herd thrived, calves strong, debts paid, the ranch hers, its deeds restored. Bert joined her, his shoulder bandaged but his stride sure, his arm slipping around her waist, warm and steady. Their initials, A and B, were carved on a fence post, a heart linking them, a quiet vow. "Corny," Anne teased, her smile soft, rare. "Ours," Bert replied, his voice warm, his eyes alight with love. They kissed, the mountains framing their future, the plains stretching toward a horizon they'd fight for together. Ranchers visited, their coalition now a community. Pete with his gruff laugh, Rosa planning a co-op to protect their lands, Cal seeking redemption through quiet work. Ellie's story won awards, Jesse's trial a public reckoning, his empire dismantled. Anne's grit, never complaining, always doing, had saved her legacy and forged a life with Bert. The cottonwoods whispered Tom's memory, their leaves dancing in the breeze. But Anne wasn't alone. Therefore, her story, born of loss, grew roots of love, enduring like the land itself. Whiskey Creek stood, a testament to her unbreakable spirit, its plains a canvas for a future she'd carved with her own hands, side by side with the man who'd chosen her fight as his own. If this story stirred something in you, whether it was a memory, a feeling, or just that quiet ache only a good Western can bring, then stick around. Here at Saddlehorn Stories, we tell the kind of tales that ride deep into the heart. Stories of hard land, harder choices, and the folks who keep going anyway. There's more where this came from. More grit, more heart, more moments that make you stop and sit a little longer in the saddle. Every week, we bring you short westerns, packed with dust, soul, and that slow burning kind of truth that only shows itself when the fire's low and the stars are out. So if you enjoyed this one, do us a favor. Hit that like button and let us know you're out there. And if you're looking for more stories that feel like home or maybe just a place to wander for a while, go on and subscribe. You'll be the first to know when a fresh tale rolls in. Until then, keep your boots by the door and your heart open. The trail's long, but you don't have to ride it alone.